Chronsega is back, and it's a special episode since it's part 1 of the Great RPG Showdown, pitting against each other two enormously popular 8-bit RPGs which just happened to be released a few days apart. First up, we have Miracle Warriors, Seal of the Dark Lord. Okay, no, not really. It's actually Phantasy Star, and if there's one single game people remember the Master System for, it's Phantasy Star. And of course, there's a lot of other great games covering August through December of 1987. Also important to note, September and October saw the release of the Master System in Europe, where, along with Brazil, the console achieved its greatest success. Also, the Mark III was re-released with the FM sound chip under the name Master System in Japan. Okay, so let's get going. Let's get started with the one game from August 1987, Doki Doki Penguin Land Uchu Daiboken, or just Penguin Land it was known outside of Japan. The Japanese subtitle means Great Space Adventure. You see, this game is set in space. Not that you would notice if you missed the introduction of your penguin rolling around an egg on the moon. Other than that, the game looks sort of like it takes place in some sort of icy dungeon, maybe somewhere in the same general area as Nintendo's Ice Climber. Now this is the first Doki Doki Penguin game we've seen, but Sega did release an earlier title for the SG-1000, the predecessor to the Master System. This 1985 game was simply called Doki Doki Penguin Land, and apparently took place near the North Pole because we see igloos and polar bears. Yeah, I know, penguins live on the South Pole. But polar bears and penguins are just one of those unstoppable video game combinations. Alright then, but what's this? Believe it or not, this game was actually released in arcades the same year. Does this look exactly like the SG-1000 version? Well, that's because the arcade game used special hardware based on the SG-1000. You have to admit that's pretty bad looking for a 1985 arcade game. As for the Master System version, it is a port, or is it a remake, or a sequel, or who really knows? I believe that some levels were borrowed directly from the first game, so maybe enhanced port might be the description that we're looking for. The object is to simply get your egg to the bottom of the level. Along the way, watch out for bears, long drops, landing on the egg, or just sort of getting stuck. A failure to do so will result in the heartbreaking scenario of the egg being destroyed right before Papa Penguin's eyes. How very cruel. Pecking at the ice will cause it to crack and the egg will drop down one level. Once you've reached the bottom, you'll find the computer room or something like that, and baby penguins will carry off the egg. And of course there are other little features like rocks you can drop on the bears or special tubes the eggs can be dropped down. Nothing too exciting, I suppose. All in all, it's a fairly typical puzzle platform game. We've seen various similar games for the Famicom. Penguin Land just has brighter colors. Still, it's not bad for such a simple arcade-style game. Hey, Sega goes Zelda! It's Nazca 88, or Aztec Adventure as it was known outside of Japan. This was the only game released in September of 1987. The Master System's release schedule for summer of 87 was pretty darn sparse, but it will pick up in October. Though comparing this to Zelda is quite an exaggeration, since Aztec Adventure is pretty much linear and straightforward. There's not really any of that wacky exploration. The structure is simple: travel through each level, defeat some bosses, and then move on to the next level. The game does superficially resemble Zelda with its non-scrolling screens and maze-like rows of bushes and rocks. The one thing that does set Aztec Adventure apart from many similar games is the fact that you can sort of hire mercenaries. When you come across these sword-wielding enemies, you can literally throw money at them. The bird is the cheapest, requires 1 money bag, and the dog is the most expensive, he takes 4. Once you acquire their services, your animal friends will march along next to you and damage any enemies they touch. They also add more firepower to your projectile weapons. Enemies will often drop a weapon of some sort. You can see your supply in the upper right-hand corner. Now one moment you say, this Nino fellow, who exactly is he? Well, his outfit makes him look like he comes from the Andes Mountains. This makes sense, as the Japanese title, Nazca 88, sort of implies it takes place in Peru. In fact, the famous Nazca lines appear in the final level. Apparently, someone felt the name Nazca was not marketable enough in the US, so it was renamed Aztec Adventure. I guess both the Aztecs and the Nazca were pre-Columbian Central/South American cultures, so I suppose that makes sense. And I'll admit the idea of hiring enemies to assist you is cool, and a similar idea was used in Magic of Scheherazade, a game that I like quite a bit. The problem is, Aztec Adventure predates the very concept of friendly unit AI. Your assistants sort of form a circle around you, but will blindly march into hostile enemies and get stuck on bushes and rocks. This becomes quite an issue in this particular level. Getting your friendly units across the rivers can be pretty tough. The game has 10 levels, but the second 5 are pretty much the same as the first 5. Now there are things I don't like about this game. Nino moves painfully slow, his knife has almost no reach, sometimes the ranged weapons don't do damage to enemies, and the mercenaries are so difficult to control, sometimes it doesn't even seem like they're actually worth hiring. Aztec Adventure is not a great game, but it does belong to the small group of Master System games that feel like a console title rather than an arcade title. This game would be unremarkable if it were released on the Famicom, but on the Master System it really stands out. So what happens in the end? Well, you finally reach the door to paradise, and what's on the other side? We never find out. But the ending sequence tells you that the real paradise lies internally in the person who dreams of it. You see, paradise is all inside us, man. That's pretty deep. Did I mention something last episode of Chronsega about Sega's unspectacular Great Sport series finally winding up? Well, it's about time to put that dog to sleep with Great Golf, also known as Masters Golf. Jesus, why are there so many golf games? Well, you have your usual 8-bit golf options, up to 4 players at once, and you can enter your name. The game also makes you choose your clubs, 14 out of 17 possible clubs. But wait, you say, wasn't there already a great golf game for the Master System? Why, yes, as a matter of fact there was. Let's go back in time to the year 1986, December 1986. This game here is the original Great Golf, as covered back in Chronsega II. This first Great Golf was released only in Japan, and used this rather sort of strange 3/4 camera angle, unlike pretty much all the other golf games of the era. Okay, so we're back to 1987 Great Golf. This is a completely different game named Masters Golf for the Japanese release. In the US and Europe, the name Great Golf was used since the first game had never been released in those territories. The exact same thing happened with the Pro Yaku pennant race being retitled Great Baseball in the West, when there was already an earlier Great Baseball in Japan. So let's take a look at the game. Obviously, this uses a more standard camera angle stationed behind the golfer, just like in most of the Famicom golf games. You know the drill by now. Choose your club, choose your direction, there's a power meter. The golf game, I think, was probably one of the first to be completely standardized. As is often the case, there is a bit of an art to putting. For those of you wanting to try the game, and I'm sure that's pretty much all of you out there, here's a pro tip. Use the other button to check the slope of the green. I didn't know that when I was making this video, so I had to use a lot of trial and error when putting. But when you hit that button, it's actually a nice touch. The guy gets down and eyeballs the slope using his golf club. Adds sort of a bit of realism to the game. Other games often have just little arrows indicating which direction the green is headed. Now I guess I'll insert my usual rant about golf games. Namely, there's too many. What have there been so far? 5 on the Famicom, and then 2 on the Master System? So I've played 7 golf games so far. I guess it's not that many, but they all seem so similar. As for Great Golf, well, there's really nothing wrong with it. It looks nicer than most of the Famicom golf games. Plays about the same. I guess the courses are, reasonably original looking. They don't all seem exactly the same. Well, I've complained a lot about the Great Sport series, and I'm pretty sure that Great Golf is the last game in this series. And at least so far, the Master System has not yet seen any Mahjong games. Next up, it's the bizarrely titled Phantasy Zone II, Opa Opa no Namida. released in the West as Phantasy Zone II, The Tears of Opa Opa. That's a rather grim title for such a bright, shiny, happy little game. Well, I guess that despite Phantasy Zone's cheerful appearance, Opa Opa does reside in a world full of death, destruction, and continuous warfare. Right. These fantasy games aren't really at all cheerful, it turns out. Now obviously, this looks a lot like Phantasy Zone 1, only a bit more colorful and detailed. It's a very nice looking game. It plays just like the first game with a few extra things added in. All the levels now feature multiple zones interconnected by these warps. You need to travel to each area, destroy all the bases, and then find the warp to the boss. And the bases now drop folding money rather than big old gold coins. I guess Phantasy Zone's economic structure has undergone some changes since the first game. And the shops, like we saw there just a second ago, work about the same. You can get speed-ups, better bombs, extra lives, and a variety of limited-use weapons. As before, an item gets more expensive each time you purchase it. The bosses are sort of similar to those in Phantasy Zone 1. The first boss you encounter in this game is also a giant log. Except that here, instead of seeds, he shoots a whole lot of flying logs at you. As expected, Phantasy Zone 2 sends Opa Opa through a series of weird-looking universes, mostly characterized by bright colors and sort of a psychedelic feel. Though from what I understand, those sorts of drugs are not nearly as common in Japan as they are in the US, so presumably the designers were under the influence of nothing more serious than cigarettes and shochu when making this game. Bosses pretty much always explode in a shower of wealth upon dying. Nothing wrong with picking up some spare cash while saving the world, right? Phantasy Zone 2 was an SMS original, but it was ported to the arcades later. Isn't that a little backwards? Sadly, the arcade version didn't really receive much of a graphical upgrade, and it's virtually identical to the Master System version. Okay, here we're back to the Master System version again. So if you liked Phantasy Zone 1, presumably you'll like this as well. Maybe it's a little bit harder. You sort of have to explore your way to each world using the warp zones. One thing's for sure, this is a darn pretty game. Definitely one of the best looking Master System games we've seen so far. The Master System goes RPG. The genre that's slowly taking over the Famicom finally comes to Sega's console with Haja no Fuuin. Jesus, it looks like you play as members of Yes in this game. Still, the game does contain a typically cool FM chip-enhanced soundtrack, and Haja no Fuuin has the distinction of being, I think, the first console RPG to be released in the United States. Sega released an English version very quickly, way before any NES RPGs, under the name Miracle Warriors: Seal of the Dark Lord. Of course, Miracle Warriors would never leave the big impression like some of the other early RPGs like Phantasy Star or Dragon Quest, mostly because it's just not very good. We've actually seen this game before in Chrontendo episode 23, that was the episode with 7 or 8 RPGs. You might recall the game originally came out for Japanese computers in 1986, and was imported to the Famicom by ASCII in October 1987 in a heavily revised edition. 5 days later, Sega's version came out, with considerably altered gameplay and brand new graphics. This version is generally considered to be the best of the many versions of Haja no Fuuin. So Miracle Warriors is a typical hardcore early RPG. You start with absolutely no money, weapons, or armor. There's not even a town nearby. You encounter random enemies on the world map. I love the fact that one of the very first enemies you encounter is called the Weasley Wimp. Using a Dragon Quest style menu, you take turns attacking each other. Pretty simple. This enemy has dropped 2 fangs. More about that a little later. Naturally, the odds are that you'll almost immediately run into a much tougher enemy, from which you can't escape, and you end up getting a game over. The other versions of this game are actually even worse in this department. You'll also occasionally find non-threatening parties on the road, such as merchants and travelers and that sort of thing. And if you survive long enough to reach a village, you'll find the NPCs with the usual helpful hints. There'll be a weapons and armor shop and a place to heal. There are no item shops really, there are healers who do sell herbs. So I guess it's time to buy a weapon, say a basic knife. Except that it cost 3,000 guilders. That's right, everything in this game is way overpriced. Luckily, you can sell fangs that the monsters drop for cash. But all in all, Miracle Warriors throws no punches. In Dragon Quest, you got a free magic refill in the first village, which thus allowed you to sort of heal up for free. Here, healing is very expensive. Everything costs a lot of money in this game. And what exactly is the story on the currency? Guilders? Does this thing take place in Holland? Now, it's going to take you a very long time to collect enough cash to actually buy the knife, armor, and shield. Most of the money you make will go right back into healing you, though you will occasionally encounter enemies that drop a lot of money, like the evil merchants. You're quite fortunate if you happen to run into a few of those. But there are actually additional expenses. See, your weapons and armor take damage when used, so you'll need to keep running back to the town and then have the blacksmith repair them. This will generally cost you several hundred guilders. My knife has a rating there of 6, which means it's about ready to break. Oh, and when you're in the in-town map, there's really no signs or descriptions or any ways to identify what the buildings actually are. You just have to enter each one and figure out if it's like a item shop or a weapon shop or whatever. So anyway, after quite a lot of grinding, you'll be strong enough to sort of venture out into the world and find some clues about your mission, namely tracking down the other 3 party members, all the while continuing to collect guilders and fangs. Now, one thing you can do is if you really want cash, you can attack friendly parties, but at a cost. You lose what are called character points. Attacking bad monsters will slowly build character. Killing a merchant or a traveler will cost you a lot in character points. And characters actually need to progress past certain points in the game. Now, Miracle Warriors is very different than most console RPGs. Not surprising since it began life on a computer. Spells, for example, are not used in combat or to heal, but are only useful at certain points to advance the plot, like here for example when you fight a party member. There are magic items that can be used in combat, but these are one-time use items dropped by monsters or purchased, and they're usually very rare or expensive. Okay, so here I've gotten my second party member. Now you might think you're going to be stronger, but combat works differently than you might think. Only one party member can attack per turn, so you can't really gang up on enemies, and only the attacking party member gains experience, so leveling when you have multiple party members is very slow. Better weapons can be found in sort of out-of-the-way places, but tend to be very expensive. You can improve your weapon a little, but it costs like 60,000 guilders. Each character has a special weapon that can be found, but these cost fangs. So you don't want to immediately go out and sell your fangs all the time, you'll need to sort of hang on to them. This whole sort of double currency is just one of the many irritating things in Miracle Warriors. It's not really clear from this dialogue here, but I actually just traded 300 fangs for the Turos sword for Guy. Do I need to mention how badly designed the display is? The image of your party on the left is really unnecessary, it just sort of shows what terrain you're on. And the teeny tiny map on the right is almost completely useless. It's very easy to get lost since it doesn't really give you a very good idea of anything other than your immediate surroundings. Furthermore, Miracle Warriors seems kind of allergic to numbers. There aren't numbers assigned to your hit points, experience, level, or damage. Instead, you just get those bars, which take about 25% of the screen. Early RPGs really struggled how to present all this information on a video game screen. It really makes you admire Dragon Quest with its relatively clean design. Naturally, I got stuck at a certain point, a powerful mini-boss that instantly slaughtered my party. No loss, I suppose, as Miracle Warriors is what the folks on the internet might call unplayable. Too much grinding to too little effect, very slow repetitive combat, and very little in terms of items or magic to add variety to the game. In other words, it's really not worthy of your time. Well, it was only a matter of time, I suppose. Sega has finally released a Mahjong game, Mahjong Sengoku Jidai. Sengoku Jidai being a pair of warring states in medieval Japan. In other words, this game is one of fierce Mahjong competition. There are sort of the typical options that you encounter. There's both the one-on-one computer-style Mahjong as well as 4-player Mahjong. Some earlier Mahjong games gave you only one such option. You don't normally associate Sega with Mahjong games, and it turns out this was not developed by Sega, but rather by Sanritsu. I believe this is Sanritsu's first Master System game. Now, Sanritsu had put out this arcade Mahjong-style game with a very similar title, Mahjong Q Jidai, which is one of those adult-style Mahjong games with sexy girls in it. The Master System game isn't quite a port of this title, but perhaps Sanritsu was called in to work on this due to their recent experience with the genre. So who were Sanritsu? Well, they were an electronics company that got into game development in the early 1980s. They hooked up with Sega pretty quickly, becoming sort of a second-party developer for Sega. Eventually, the Sanritsu development team transformed into Sims, which was eventually absorbed into Sega, but has since become an independent entity once again. Sanritsu and Sims ported tons of games to various Sega platforms, and we'll be seeing their name quite a bit in Chronsega. As for Mahjong games, well, unlike the Famicom, the Master System never became a Mahjong-heavy platform. If I'm not mistaken, this may have been the only one. Now let's move on to an arcade port, the first of a few this episode. This is Alien Syndrome. I guess you might call it a run and gun, with two-player co-op as an option. As you might have guessed from the cover art, Alien Syndrome clearly borrows from the 20th Century Fox movies. Remember that Aliens, the second one, had just come out in 1986. Both the US and the Japanese box art depict a creature which looks pretty much exactly like the one found in Alien and Aliens. Now, as we've noticed, Sega has been porting Master System titles from very recent arcade games. Alien Syndrome was no exception. The arcade version was released in 1987 as well. The gameplay is simple: run around blasting aliens and rescuing your fellow humans, who are scattered about the base. The arcade game might be considered a minor classic. After all, killing aliens with flamethrowers is pretty fun. On the other hand, the Master System port isn't nearly as successful for a number of reasons. The game has been changed quite a bit. Rather than the smooth overhead scrolling of the original, we now have like this flip screen effect, giving a sort of slight Zelda feel. Also, enemies materialize a couple seconds after you enter the room. I suppose this is good. It means you can't immediately run into one upon entering a room, but one problem does arise is often they'll materialize like right next to you, or pretty much on top of you. When this does happen, you need to move out of the way pretty quickly, or else you'll lose a life. Naturally, you start out criminally underpowered, but you can find lasers, flamethrowers, etc. throughout the base. There's those little letters that you see scattered about in the walls there. Once you've found all the humans, and there's actually a very helpful status screen to tell you how many more you need to find, you then hustle back to the exit and face a boss. Now, the original used the Sega System 16A board, which was also used for SDI, Shinobi, Phantasy Zone. And while the Master System obviously doesn't have the power of the 16A, the home version is pretty lame looking. I mean, really, this looks like a more colorful Famicom game. And part of the issue I have with this is that everything, the graphics, the sound, the layout, the general sort of feel of the gameplay, has been changed to such an extent that the Master System Alien Syndrome doesn't really feel like the same game. Incidentally, this was ported by Sanritsu, which may be at least a partial explanation. I've cleared the first round here and I move on to the rather phallic-looking Clio spaceship. You know, a lot of the Master System ports have been pretty hit or miss so far. We've seen some great versions of Phantasy Zone and Wonder Boy, and then unimpressive titles like Enduro Racer and this. I wish Sega would be a bit more consistent when porting their arcade favorites. Moving right along, it's the last game of October, SDI, or Global Defense it was called in the West. New York, destroyed by atomic bombs. Looks like a Roland Emmerich movie. Wikipedia describes this intro as quote-unquote notorious. So for the young folks out there, the Strategic Defense Initiative was a far-fetched plan to build a missile system that would shoot down ICBMs from outer space. The idea was supported by Ronald Reagan, and critics of the time referred to the plan as Star Wars. Obviously, it never really got beyond the planning stages. The Strategic Defense Initiative, or SDI for short, was quite a hot topic of discussion back in the 1980s. SDI was originally an arcade game, one that we just saw in Chrontendo Episode 23, 1987 Arcade Roundup. This game used a trackball controller and sort of resembled a heavily updated version of Atari's Missile Command. The Master System game just uses a standard controller. In the first section, the offensive half, you attempt to shoot any passing missiles, spaceships, etc., while avoiding enemies and projectiles. The control scheme is odd. The D-pad moves the reticle around and you use one button to fire. However, in order to move your ship, you need to hold down the other button while using the D-pad. It is a little awkward. So if you survive this segment, the space shuttle will actually give you a lift to the second stage, which is known as the defensive half. Here, all the remaining enemy missiles are approaching Earth, and you need to shoot them as they pass by. You know what this game really reminds me of? Missile Defense 3D, which we covered last episode. I'm not really sure when Missile Defense 3D was released, possibly after this one, who knows? Well, someone at Sega must have really had a fixation with missile defense systems and nuclear devastation. Either way, there is a valuable lesson here, I suppose. If Earth is being attacked by aliens, we'll definitely need more than one missile defense ship. Just like the old Missile Command game, if too many missiles hit Earth, you will then get a game over. The nuclear apocalypse is depicted as sort of a flashing screen. That was a common video game shorthand for huge explosion back in the day. On the other hand, if you are successful in defending Earth, then those same two stages will just repeat themselves over and over again. Nothing really wrong with SDI, it's just sort of a minor game. We need to clean up a few non-Japanese titles before moving on. Let's start with Bank Panic, a Europe-only title, which shows a copyright of 1987, so it was presumably released the second half of that year. The Master System was released in Europe in September. Now, Bank Panic is a port of the 1984 arcade game, developed by Sanritsu and published by Sega. In this game, you're acting as sort of a security guard in the bank, shooting any bank robbers that appear while not shooting any customers. You can see 3 doors at a time, and you have 3 separate fire buttons, corresponding to each of the on-screen doors. Bank Panic was a nice little game, though I suppose it was a little violent. Whenever you shot a bandit, you'll see a little geyser of blood kind of squirt out as he fell back. As was typical, Bank Panic was ported to various computer systems, and Sega themselves actually released a version in 1985 on the SG-1000. This version was obviously a little ugly, but it was a reasonable facsimile of the original. The fact that the SG-1000 did not have 3 buttons meant you had to use up or down on the control pad in order to shoot at the left door. Buttons 1 and 2 allowed you to shoot at the middle and right doors respectively. For the Master System version, the same control scheme was used. Apparently, banking has changed a lot since the days of the Wild West. For example, rather than filling out a deposit slip, you could simply open a door, say hi, and throw your money inside the bank and leave. Banks also had circular floor pans and a lot of doors. This would be bad for security purposes, I suppose. Fortunately, bandits won't shoot you in the back. Rather, they'll wait behind the door until you're facing that particular door, then open it, then shoot at you. At the very top of the screen there, you can see if anyone's behind a door or approaching a door by looking at the red bars behind each door number. Doors will open automatically when you are facing a door with someone behind it. If it's a bandit, shoot, but not too quickly, because that's considered to be unfair. Now, once deposits have been made at all the doors, you will then move on to the next level. There's various other factors as well. Ticking bombs will sometimes appear on the door. Shooting the bomb will somehow render it harmless. Bandits will often be standing behind kidnapped customers, and you can get a bonus by shooting hats off a kid's head. Each new level is exactly the same, only with a slightly higher difficulty. This being an old sort of fashioned arcade game, points figure pretty heavily into the game. You can lose a life either by getting shot by a bandit or by accidentally shooting a customer. Naturally, when you hit a female customer, you get a rather gratuitous view up her skirt. Typical for a Japanese game, I suppose. But all in all, Bank Panic is a fun little game. A bit of a trifle gameplay-wise, but it's still a pretty well-handled port. Well, here's another non-Japanese release, one which came out sometime in 1987, Ghostbusters, one of the many versions of David Crane's computer game. Pretty much all the versions feature a very similar opening. But here, what's that little thing bouncing up and down? Looks like a Puyo Puyo blob. Yep, the Master System Ghostbusters was ported by Compile, those reliable guns for hire. The original release was, of course, the 1984 Commodore 64 game from Activision. The Master System version sticks pretty closely to this. Obviously, the Commodore 64 game is pretty ugly looking, and there actually are some differences in some of the mechanics, like the driving sequences are very different. One thing that the Commodore version does have is there are actually a few voice samples.
He slimed me!
Now we saw the Famicom port back in Chrontendo 10. Those of you who saw that episode know that I hated the Famicom Ghostbusters. Sega's games is a little better. As expected, the Master System Ghostbusters gives you very pretty graphics. You start out choosing your vehicle and your items, which range from absolutely necessary to utterly worthless. As you collect cash, you can buy more items or upgrades, but it's not really necessary. I played the game without getting any upgrades. So when you see the flashing building, move your Ghostbuster icon to that building. You'll have a rather boring little driving sequence. If you cross the path of any ghosts on the world map, you can try to suck them up while driving. Then you set down your ghost trap and use your proton beams to herd the ghost above the trap and then activate it. If you manage to get all the ghosts in the trap, great. If any escape, you will be slimed and one of your Ghostbusters will be out of commission. You will then need to drive to the Ghostbuster headquarters and empty the traps and revive any slimed characters. One irritating thing not found in the Famicom game is Mr. Stay Puft. You need to have $1,000 when the city's PK energy gets full, otherwise the game simply ends. It sounds easy, but in the Master System version, occasionally ghosts will combine to form Mr. Stay Puft, who will then destroy a building. Apparently the city will fine you $4,000 if this happens, which can drain your cash pretty quickly. Now once the PK energy is full, you then have to move on to the next part, in which you simply have to avoid Mr. Stay Puft here and enter the building's doorway. You need to get 2 out of 3 Ghostbusters in. Now, the March of the Stairs was the absolute worst part in the Famicom game. Definitely one of the most shockingly bad video game moments we've seen so far. Thankfully, this version is much less annoying. You control your characters normally, though you do have to avoid the dishes that the ghost throws at you. You have 3 chances, and if you get hit, you'll start once again at the very beginning. The final part simply has you zapping Gozer until he dies. Gozer shoots out these rather difficult to avoid lightning bolts, so it's best to stick to the sides to avoid getting hit. The primary complaint that I have about Ghostbusters is that it's not really a cohesive game, but rather several simple minigames kind of strung together. They range from pointless, like the driving sequences, to aggravating, like fighting Gozer. But none are really interesting by themselves. The Master System Ghostbusters is better than the Famicom release, but that means it's only uninteresting instead of just awful. Ghostbusters doesn't feature much in way of like an introductory sequence or an ending. Basically, you just get this little text scroll here, which is I guess sort of typical of kind of, lower quality games of the 1980s. Ah, Zaxxon. But wait, this is Zaxxon 3D? Do you remember those fancy electronic 3D glasses Sega put out? They were used in Missile Defense 3D? Hardly any games were made for them, but here's the second to do so. It's Zaxxon 3D. But before we go any further, do all you whippersnappers out there know Zaxxon? This 1982 arcade classic was one of the first games to put Sega on the map. Even back then, Sega was making some sort of attempts at sort of a 3D game. Zaxxon used isometric perspective. I believe this was the first Sega game to do so. That and the detailed scrolling surface of the space fortress set Zaxxon apart from the typical shooters of the era. 5 years later, Sega tries to revive the Zaxxon franchise with this game. One helpful tip, there is a hidden option menu that lets you play the game in standard 2D if you don't have the glasses. That's what we're doing here. As you might notice, it's really hard to hit anything in this game. That's because you have to be lined up vertically with the enemy ship in order for your laser to hit it. But you can't really tell where you are in relationship to the other ships. Sega tries to fix this by having a little gun sight appear in front of you when you're correctly lined up. But really, this shouldn't be necessary. Sega was able to pull off a very similar style of gameplay in Space Harrier, and Konami's Falsion was very similar to Zaxxon 3D, but much easier to play. So as you can see, Zaxxon 3D is a pretty unattractive game. Quite frankly, the original Zaxxon looked better than this. I hope the 3D version plays a little better in 3D, because this is seriously wretched. I'm going to have to put this down as about the worst game we've seen for the Master System so far. Ah yes, Alex Kidd, Sega's mascot before they came up with that little blue rodent, whatever his name was. Alex was very much a man dedicated to action and danger, running, jumping, pounding everyone into submission with his mighty fists. Whether he was saving his kingdom or just looking for a video arcade, Alex would let nothing stop him. So, naturally, when Sega decided to produce a new Alex Kidd game, they continued this fine tradition by placing him in a bicycle racing game. Jesus, looks like Alex is riding a tricycle or something. In case you're wondering, no, this was not released outside of Japan. And for those of you in the West, are you missing anything? As far as I can tell, no. Just like Woody Pop, Alex Kidd BMX Trial makes use of a special dial controller and can't be played without it. But the opinion of those who have played it seems to be that the game is sort of nothing special. So honestly, what were Sega thinking? Presumably they had seen all those Nintendo sports games and where Mario appears. Well, this didn't really work that well, and hopefully they learn their lesson. I'm sure in the future Sega will never dilute the value of their mascots by placing them in silly spin-off games that no one likes. Alright, Decemeber. Whereas the Famicom had about 33 or so games in Decemeber, the Master System has 5. But one of those games is very good, and no, this is not that game. This is a port of Afterburner, Sega's very recent arcade game, and the latest in their series of 3D super-scalar games, just like Space Harrier, Enduro Racer, and so on. Afterburner features insane, fast, sprite-based 3D action. And note how the score graphic in the upper left-hand corner there looks just like the logo from the movie Top Gun. We saw a bit of Afterburner 2 just recently in Chrontendo, the 1987 arcade roundup, but this is Afterburner 1. Afterburner 2 wasn't a real sequel, just a somewhat revised version of the first game. And of course we have the standard awesome music, huge explosions, great sound effects, really pretty much everything you could want in a Sega game back in 1987. Man, this is one nice looking game. Not sure how it's even possible to fit that many darn sprites on the screen at once, but I guess the hardware is capable. Okay, now let's take a look at the Master System version. Well, at least they got the speech sample in there. Obviously, the Master System Afterburner is not quite the visceral experience that the arcade game is. Not that Sega didn't try, it looks pretty good for an 8-bit port of a state-of-the-art arcade game, and it's not the ugly mess the port of Space Harrier was, but everything's been toned down to such an extent it doesn't even really feel like the same game. One important fact, this is a huge game. The cartridge was 4 megabits, the largest game released on a cartridge so far. The biggest Famicom game at this point was only 2 megs. Undoubtedly, a lot of work went into this. I mean, it's not really that bad, but it's a shame the game isn't better. Your plane suffers from what I guess I would call the slalom syndrome after Rare's game. The controls are not finely tuned. Hitting the D-pad will cause the plane to turn like at a 45-degree angle, so you don't have like a smooth range of motion. Hitting the enemy crafts with your guns is almost impossible, and the backgrounds are pretty empty and barren looking. Unfortunately, the port sort of removes pretty much everything that's awesome about the arcade game, and leaves us with this sort of the bare skeleton of Afterburner. Though I suppose that when you collide with another jet, the explosion is pretty cool looking. Obviously, this raises an issue. Releasing decent ports of their arcade games is rapidly becoming a non-option for Sega. So what's the future of the Master System? Is Sega gonna focus more on better console-style games? Or maybe they might just scrap the whole system and come out with a more powerful console? I guess we'll see eventually. Sega sure doesn't beat around the bush when it comes to sequels on the Master System. 7 months after the first game, we have Zillion II, the Tri-Formation, or just Tri-Formation as the screen says here. See, there's the difference between Chrontendo and Chronsega. With Chronsega we can play game 1 episode and then the sequel on the very next episode. Now Zillion was a long, ambitious Metroid-like game based on an animated series, co-created by Sega. I didn't really like the first Zillion game, I thought it was too repetitive, but admired Sega for trying to make a sort of like a big, ambitious game. Zillion II is a completely different matter. It's supposedly still based on the same anime, but it doesn't really go out of its way to do anything with the source material. There's no introductions or cutscenes or dialogue that I know of. As for the gameplay, well, as you can see, it's now a straightforward drive and shoot sort of game. As much as I dislike Zillion, I mean Zillion 2 is much worse. This ranks with Alex Kidd and High Tech World for really baffling sequels. Pretty much everything from the first game has been scuttled. Zillion 2 has several straightforward levels with the occasional boss or boss-like encounter at the end. On the first level you're on your bike jumping and shooting, though you can also transform to a flying suit called the Armorator. This makes the vehicle segments a bit easier. Basically, you need to shoot enemies as they appear while jumping over the occasional pit or enemy bullet. You have a life bar, which is good as it's pretty easy to take damage. It can be tricky after playing Nintendo games to switch to the Master System with its reversed shoot and jump buttons, especially on those forced scrolling sections. It can be really easy to get the buttons confused. The game alternates between the vehicle levels and the foot levels, 4 of each. One thing should be pointed out, Zillion 2 is a terrible, annoying, boring game. It's sort of like Transformers Convoy no Nazo. As you're moving forward, enemies will appearing on the far edges of the screen, and they fire the second they come into view. As a result, the best way to avoid taking much damage is simply to move forward slowly while constantly firing. For those hoping for a decent Zillion sequel that would fix some of the issues in the first game, well, this really sort of boggles the mind. Along with Zaxxon 3D, I'd say it's one of the worst games for the system. Out of all the titles released for the Master System, there's one that stands above the rest, almost universally regarded as the best Master System game. I'm referring of course to Phantasy Star. Before we go any further, let's check out these music samples. First of all, we'll listen to the US version. And this is the Japanese version with the FM sound chip. As you can hear, we got seriously screwed in the music department. For this reason, we'll be playing a retranslation of the Japanese release, done by SMS Power. As a very early attempt at localizing an RPG, Phantasy Star had dialogue changed or removed, names altered, and so on. So the SMS Power translation is very much superior to the original US version. Phantasy Star has your typical RPG plot. Alicia's brother is killed after opposing Lashiek, the evil tyrant of the land. Alicia vows to defeat Lashiek. Though is it really a good idea for them to have this conversation in the middle of the street with Imperial soldiers standing right there? But hey, let's quickly discuss the game's title. I've sort of read on the internet that some people are a bit confused about the spelling of fantasy, thinking it's some kind of like weird Japanese translation layer or something like that, but that's not really the case. In fact, the PH spelling was quite common before the early 20th century. The word fantasy comes from the Greek phantasia, and there are still words which bear traces of the older spelling, like phantasm or phantasmagoria. The PH spelling is intended to give it sort of like an archaic feel because this is, a fantasy game. So the now standard RPG elements are all here. Level, experience, various stats, item, magic, the village, the shops. All of this looks, well, just like Dragon Quest. You walk around talking to NPCs who give you the hints and clues as to what to do first. Now there is a spaceport nearby, but you can't access it without a pass. You can, however, travel to the next city. Phantasy Star is unusual in that it gives you 3 cities very close by to which you can access from the very start of the game. If you check out the shops in these cities, you'll find some pretty good armors and weapons, but you really can't afford them yet. Now once you venture out beyond the walls protecting the city, you'll encounter the random enemies. The flies in this game are sort of like the equivalent to Dragon Quest slimes. Combat is very much like in Dragon Quest, turn-based. You can use items, magic, or physical attack. Monsters drop a chest with money inside. Though really, how could a fly carry around a big chest like that? Naturally, if you stray more than a few yards outside the gate, you'll encounter some way too powerful enemies. As a rule, the strength of the random monsters can increase dramatically without warning in Phantasy Star. In the beginning, you'll need to fight a battle or two, then quickly head back to the first town to heal, and then repeat until you've gained a couple levels and can buy some actual equipment. One area where Phantasy Star and Dragon Quest part company is the dungeons. Dragon Quest used top-down dungeon, but Phantasy Star goes for the old-school US-style first-person dungeons. But man, the dungeons are where the graphical power of the Master System really shines. Unlike Deep Dungeon or Megami Tensei, moving around in the dungeons looks very smooth. The walls look solid, the lighting is good, there's both ceilings and floors, and everything is sort of faded into the distance in the background. Lots of Famicom games have tried unsuccessfully to create convincing first-person dungeons, but Phantasy Star is the first 8-bit game to do so. So anyway, your next goal is to try to track down your other companions. Clues point you towards another planet, but you'll need to search around for the Road Pass, which is an expensive hidden item sold in this one particular shop. Once you've obtained that, you can get past those pesky guards and make your way to the spaceport, and eventually hop onto the spaceship. There are 3 planets in the solar system, and they function sort of like the continents in Dragon Quest II. Naturally, you won't be able to access the entire game world right away, and eventually you'll need to get your own spaceship so you can access the last planet. You don't really control the spaceship, it simply shuttles you back and forth between the few different cities. So it's almost kind of like a warp portal, more than like the boat in Dragon Quest II, which you can actually steer around. Now, among Phantasy Star's strengths is its great art style. The character portraits are beautiful, and the dialogue between the characters are reasonably naturalistic. It's not, Legend of Zelda speak. By 1987, characters in video games have become much more talkative, especially RPGs. You get big walls of text in these games. Sadly, in this game, characterization is pretty limited. Virtually the only time your characters speak, or like here, when a new party member is introduced. After this, everyone is pretty much never heard from again. This strange silence from your characters leads to some odd moments. Oh, by the way, here, for example, I found Tylon. He's the second party member. He's sort of a typical tough guy with a flat top, but oddly enough, his hit points and strength are actually less than Meow, the talking cat. Now, I mentioned how the lack of dialogue has some strange moments. Here, for example, you have this rather shocking and horrifying occurrence, yet no one has any reaction whatsoever to Meow being killed, and it really has no consequences at all. Obviously, this is not exactly, Final Fantasy VII when someone gets killed. Much like Dragon Quest I, the final dungeon is quite close to the starting point, and you can go there first thing, but you have no way of opening this damn door until you get Lutz and then level up quite a lot. Phantasy Star takes a page from Ultima 3, and I suppose also Hoshi no Mirohito, by having 4 characters, not just 3. Other than the great graphics, there's a lot of things to like about this game. It demonstrates an almost satirical sense of humor at times, such as this fellow selling cakes from inside a dungeon. The goal of many of the dungeons is simply a quest item or a merely helpful item. Here the cake is required to visit the governor, who provides you with a letter with which to convince Lutz to join your party. In a nice touch, we have here what might be the first fake battle in which you automatically lose in a Japanese RPG. This nightmare appears and slaughters your party, but it turns out it was all just a dream. Or was it? There's quite a bit of variety in the overworld. Some villages are high-tech, others are run-down and rural. Aside from the main planet, there's a desert planet and the ice planet. There are patches of bubbling lava, beaches, forests, each with their own sort of battle screen background. And the monsters are all animated, sometimes in sort of very amusing ways. Thus, the different scenes make quite a bit more of an impression than Dragon Quest's static monsters and backdrops. Other than the spaceship that you eventually find, you'll need to get something called the Flow Mover, which is actually called the Hovercraft in the US version, which allows you to travel over water and lava. Later, you'll need to get a vehicle that can smash through blocks of ice. And of course you'll constantly be buying better armor and weapons. Here I'm hopping into the flow mover here. You need this to access places like that island. Much like Ultima 3 and Dragon Quest, not all equipment can be used by all characters. Meow requires special equipment, and Lutz, the magic user, much like the princess in Dragon Quest 2, needs robes and wands and such. Another cool moment, Lutz has a one-on-one magic battle with a master magician, who naturally lives in the bottom of the dungeon. Lutz, by the way, is one of the sort of typical magic users, virtually useless at first, but once leveled up with good armor and more magic points, he becomes much more useful. Still, spells consume enough points that you will often find yourself sort of reserving them for boss battles. And of course, one great thing about the game is all the monsters. All these huge, colorful, animated, and almost always super cool monsters. Much of the game's appeal is due to Riko Kodama's design and characters. Phantasy Star demonstrates there was some major talent at Sega working on console games. Phantasy Star was conceived by Kotaro Hayashida, who had also worked on Alex Kidd and Zillion. The game was programmed by Yuji Naka, who later went on to games like Sonic the Hedgehog. Still, Phantasy Star is very much a product of its time. One of the weaknesses is the combat. Unlike Dragon Quest, you can only face one kind of enemy at a time. You can't select which enemy you want to attack, and your characters will simply choose a random enemy. This means you'll often find yourself sort of whittling down the group of enemies' health, rather than actually concentrating on taking them out one at a time. The combat is very simple. It's mostly a matter of hitting the attack button over and over again. Magic is pretty limited. Lutz has some spells, fire, wind, and lightning, but they consume too many points to use all the time, and there are also a few very basic support skills. Despite the elemental properties of Lutz's magic, enemies don't really seem to have any specific weaknesses. There's only one status ailment. A party member can become temporarily bound up and can't move. The items don't really factor much into battle. In other words, despite the 4-character party, combat seems sort of halfway between Dragon Quest 1 and Dragon Quest 2. Now, while the 3D dungeons look great, they can become repetitive. Every dungeon looks the same, only the colors change. Oh, here I'm finally going into that one prison I couldn't get into earlier. Throughout the game you travel through caves, warehouses, dungeons, towers, and a morgue, all of which look identical on the inside. Unfortunately, this lack of variety in dungeons makes them become sort of a bit of a drag, especially because there's just so darn many dungeons in this game. This right here was actually a prison, but it looks kind of like every other dungeon in the game. Towards the end of the game, I was actually finding I was sort of getting a little sick of fighting through dungeons. Phantasy Star starts out very strong as you cross the galaxy looking for your companions, but the last third or so of the game simply becomes a matter of slogging through one identical dungeon after another looking for some special item which is required to get to the boss's lair, such as the arrow prism or these magical berries. There's no in-game map, so you need to actually either draw out the dungeons on paper or look up maps on the internet, I suppose. Furthermore, there's not really much point in fighting enemies after a while. Once you reach around level 24 or so, you'll start taking about 5,000 plus experience points to reach the next level, and the toughest regular enemies drop around maybe 25 to 30 points at most, so I figured there was no point in actually trying to kill enemies during the last couple dungeons. Healing items are pretty much worthless, and magic is virtually required to damage the final bosses, so you can't afford to lose much health during these final few dungeons. So after one very long dungeon, 8 floors with about 25 different flights of stairs, you will feed Meow the berries and then fly to the boss's lair, and find a normal looking town, sort of like in Dragon Quest 2, but there's actually a special gold dragon boss you'll encounter first. Here is Meow is transformed into a flying cat. Now once you actually get past this dragon and you get there, there's another lengthy dungeon, though this one's actually a mere 5 floors. They end up being the final boss himself. And unfortunately there's really no place here to like replenish your magic or your health or anything. So like I was saying, basically it's the last few dungeons are more of a matter of like enemy avoidance than anything else. Okay, so here is Lashiek. He asks you a question, but don't worry, the game won't end if you choose the wrong answer, like in the first Dragon Quest game. Now, despite the game stressing the importance of the Laconian weapons that you had to sort of trek all over the galaxy to find, they are pretty much useless against this guy. They almost usually always miss, so Alicia should actually use her fire spell, and Lutz's spells will be doing most of the damage. Oddly, the best weapon in the game is the laser gun. After defeating this guy, well, the game is actually not over. Nope, it tells you you have to go and speak to the governor. So in other words, you'll need to trek all the way back to the desert planet, enter his palace, and find, you guessed it, another dungeon. There are about 25 dungeons in this game, and while they look great, I mean, eventually I think you will sort of get tired of drawing all those damn maps. So if Logic seemed a little bit sort of uneventful and anticlimactic, that's because there is of course one final boss, Dark Force. Yep, there's the whole one more boss thing at the very end, which is sort of becoming sort of like standard practice in RPGs at this point. So Phantasy Star is a great game, people love it, and with it Sega proved they could create a title that would rival almost anything on Nintendo's system. Now there was a price. The Phantasy Star 4 megabit cartridge retailed for $69.99. That's about $125 in today's money. Was it worth it? Well, I don't know. So here's Dark Force. What's the strategy for defeating him? Well, just sort of hit him with everything you got until you run out of magic. As I mentioned, there's really no sort of strategy required for any battles in Phantasy Star. After this, you get a pretty decent little ending sequence, and then Phantasy Star is one of the first games to have sort of actually like really kind of cool, decent looking credits. It's not just like the typical, list of names scrolling up the screen. So there we have Phantasy Star. I guess sort of a rundown of the good points. Well, great graphics, a really fantastic soundtrack, very awesome looking monsters, the detailed character and NPC portraits make them feel sort of like more like real characters as opposed to just video game sprites. On the negative side, there's combat that was a little simple even by 1987 standards. And there's really not a whole lot of variety in the gameplay. It's sort of walk around, find a dungeon, fight your way through the dungeon, grab the item, get out, then go on to the next dungeon. Some people call this the best 8-bit RPG. It's certainly the best looking 8-bit RPG. Whether it plays that great, well, I guess it's sort of a matter of personal opinion. If you're any sort of fan of early RPGs, this is one game that you definitely must play. Well, we didn't quite finish 1987. There's still a couple games left, released in December. We'll take care of those in Chronsega Episode 5. And then it's on to 1988, including the first Master System games from a third-party publisher. But first, we'll have the second half of the December 1987 RPG Showdown with Chrontendo 26 and Final Fantasy. See you soon.